Since the advent of naval gunnery, people have had a need to practice their shot, using the hulks of elderly and outdated ships, for example. However, during the 20th century, with the advent of certain technologies, navies were able to create radio-controlled gunnery target ships, like HMS Agamemnon or SMS Hessen. In today's video, we'll go over some of the most interesting radio-controlled gunnery ships in history. I think it's important to give you all some context as to what the heck we're talking about. I know Wikipedia gets a bad rap, but I think their definition of what a target ship is gives you a pretty clear picture of what we're talking about. A target ship is a vessel, typically an obsolete or captured warship, used as a seaborne target for naval gunnery practice or weapons testing. Targets may be used to test the effectiveness of specific types of ammunition, or the target ship may be used for an extended period of routine target practice with specialized non-explosive ammunition. The potential consequence of a drifting wreck required careful preparation of the target ship to prevent pollution or a floating or submerged collision risk for maritime navigation. Like I mentioned in the introduction, during the 20th century, as technology developed, nations such as Britain, the United States, Germany, and so on were able to fit equipment to these vessels to be able to control them remotely from a safe distance and for these vessels to be able to take a hit. Our next weird ship is SMS Hessen, a vessel that started life as a normal battleship, albeit a pre-dreadnought, but still a normal battleship. Hessen was part of the Bismarck-class of battleships, armed with a main battery of 4 28cm guns, in common with other pre-dreadnoughts, a variety of smaller calibers including 17cm and 8.8cm guns, all being propelled at a stately top speed of 18 knots. Hessen was commissioned in September 1905, and only a short time later, in 1906, was HMS Dreadnought birthed into the world, making Hessen obsolete. Nevertheless, the battleship stayed commissioned and went on to take part in the First World War and even participated in the Battle of Jutland. In this, Hessen did not do anything of note during the battle. After the battle, she was decommissioned and disarmed, being converted into an accommodation vessel for submarine crews. Here, she was given a nickname on her side. She was painted with the warning SMS Kleinste Fahrt, or SMS Slowest Possible Speed, which meant an utmost reduction of speed for any passing vessel to not damage her moorings due to the swell or suction effects. After the war and the scuttling of the high seas fleet, the new German Navy, the Reichsmarine, was allowed to keep a limited number of vessels, including some of these obsolete pre-dreadnought battleships, including the Hessen, were to take from Dodson again. In the autumn of 1919, the 6 battleships foreseen as the future German battle fleet, Hanover, Schlesien, Schleswig-Holstein, Braunschweig, Hessen, and Alsace, were towed from Kiel to Wilhelmshaven, while in March 1920, the Allies permitted the retention of an extra pair of battleships, as well as 2 extra cruisers, 4 more destroyers, and 4 torpedo boats, 30 in reserve with guns aboard. Article 181 had previously required that all ships in reserve be fully disarmed. Hessen recommissioned into the new Reichsmarine in January of 1925 and was rearmed, including her full 17cm battery and the addition of 4 casemate torpedo tubes forward and aft. She also had her boilers replaced by oil-fired water tube units and several other upgrades and changes as compared to her sisters. Hessen operated with the new German Navy in various roles, venturing around European waters and receiving upgrades until the early 1930s, when she was decommissioned in November of 1934 as more modern vessels entered the fleet. With the rise of the Nazi Party and the revitalization of the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine would need target practice to account for all the new vessels being planned and constructed. This is where things start to get interesting for Hessen, as she was struck from the Naval Register, again taking from Dodson. As German rearmament gathered pace, the fleet's target practice requirements were no longer satisfied. As a result, Hessen was taken in hand at Wilhelmshaven during 1935 to 1937 to be rebuilt as an additional radio-controlled target ship. Hessen was stripped down to the bare hull, and a new forepart was constructed, lengthening the ship by 10 meters. All existing machinery was removed and replaced by 3 modern high-pressure boilers and 2 sets of turbines, producing 25,000 shaft horsepower for a maximum speed of 20.3 knots. The only armament was a single 50cm torpedo tube installed for experimental purposes, although a pair of 10.5cm AA guns were added after 1940. Still, the protection was reinforced by additional modern armor of WH quality steel to allow her to withstand the 38cm guns of the Bismarck-class vessels then under construction. The forward barbette of the ship was used to house the capstan, while the aft one housed the ship's control mechanism, which could be operated remotely from the control vessel Blitz. Hessen's modest bridgework aft of the deckhouse supported the funnel. The ship was utterly unrecognizable from her former self, and only recesses fore and aft of the former main deck secondary battery gave any glimpses of her origin. She served in this role from 1937 on, even through the duration of the Second World War, with only slight deviations from this role during the war. In any case, the former battleship was one of the few German warships intact after the Second World War, and was included among the ships that were to be divided up amongst the Allies by the Potsdam Agreement. Falling together with her control vessel Blitz, the Hessen was ceded to the Soviet Union following the Second World War. In company with the light cruiser Nürnberg, on January 2, 1946, she left for the Soviet Union. In June of that year, she was recommissioned as the Cell and continued to serve with the Blitz, now Vistral, until 1960, when she was stricken and broken up. Almost 60 years since the former Hessen's keel had been laid. She had been in active service in 4 fleets and 2 navies. A very interesting and odd career for a battleship. Next on our list is HMS Agamemnon, a pre-dreadnought battleship from the United Kingdom, one of the last pre-dreadnoughts built actually. Nevertheless, the United Kingdom was looking for a suitable target ship, particularly the Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet in September 1918, Admiral David Beatty, where R.A. Burt in his book British Battleships 1889 to 1904 writes, "On September 14, 1918, C&C David Beatty wrote to their lordships at the Admiralty explaining his theory that practical gunnery experience was required for many of the ships in the battle fleet, because they had not seen action, or had a chance to fire their guns at a suitable target even in practice shoots. War experience had emphasized the importance of observation of fire as the principal factor in successful fire control. The newly introduced system of throw-off firing provides excellent practice for the control personnel in all respects except observation on fire, which is not furnished in a realistic manner during target firings under modern conditions. It is over 2 years since the battle fleet had any action experience, and a large number of control officers have joined. Important decisions governing fire control and concentration now have to be decided largely on conjecture, so far as observations of fire is concerned. This leaves an element of doubt as to what is or is not practical under action conditions. It is therefore considered a matter of urgency that some practice in spotting against a ship target under realistic conditions should be afforded to control officers. To meet the requirements, it is proposed that a hulk target be provided, either an obsolete warship or damaged merchant vessel, and that a full caliber firing with practice shot be carried out periodically and witnessed by control officers who can be accommodated in the firing ship or ships. It is requested that this important matter may receive their lordships' early consideration." Receiving the request what Admiral Beatty had said, their lordships in the Admiralty made moves to sanction the use of one of the many obsolete warships available, and in early 1919, firing test was carried out at Shoebury-Ness on plates of a similar thickness to those fitted in the old pre-dreadnoughts. Their decks to be more specific, but it was realized that any ship with 15-inch shells would sink her quickly, i.e. the most modern battleships of the fleet and some of the 15-inch monitors. Therefore, it was decided that the target ship should be fired on by ships with 6-inch guns or less, so light cruisers and below. At first, they were going to use the old Hibernia of the King George VII class, but Agamemnon was put forward on offer, and she was eagerly accepted because she was much newer. Work proceeded on December 6, 1920. There were some issues they ran into when they were stripping the old battleship down. She wasn't going to be stable once they removed her 12-inch and 9.2-inch guns. To overcome this to some extent, they placed ballast in compartments below the main deck and filled others with cork for extra buoyancy. She was completely rewired for extra communication, and many electrical controls were placed all over the ship, as she was going to be wirelessly controlled at times, as befits the theme of the video. Thankfully, R.A. Burt lists out all of the changes the ship went under to be converted into a radio-controlled gunnery ship. Removal of all 12-inch guns and mountings, plus all hydraulic gear associated with them. Removal of all 9.2-inch guns and mountings, plus turrets and hydraulic gears. Removal of all 12-pounders and equipment. Removal of all coamings, unheated hatches, scuttles, and lifts. Open ports plated up after removal. Removal of all mess gear and spaces cleared. All CO2 machinery removed. All ventilation trunks were removed and plated up. Lower conning tower removed. 1,000 tons of ballast placed in various parts of the ship as seen necessary. All torpedo equipment removed. All refrigeration equipment removed. Flying deck removed. Sea cabins removed. Main derrick and boat booms removed. Wireless telegraphy office replaced by new control office. All small fittings, such as boat davits, anchor gear, coal winches, storage boxes, etc., were removed. All mast and yards removed. As of April 13th, 1921, these were Agamemnon's particulars. Some pretty interesting details. Anyway, the first trials were carried out on March 19th, 1921, to see how a modern battleship would stand up against a gas attack. However, there are very few records of this trial. Yet it appears the Admiralty found that crews of the upper decks might be at risk if a ship ran through a noxious cloud of gas, but Agamemnon wasn't properly sealed before the trials, so that accurate data couldn't be recorded. We're to take from R.A. Burt. On September 21st, 1921, trials were carried out to ascertain the effect of machine gun fire from aircraft. It was appreciated that in such tests, conditions were artificially favorable to the attacking craft, as any modern warship would not just sit there in water and would certainly return any fire. Nevertheless, the test was to see if any of the personnel would be in danger in exposed areas. The trials showed that a modern, well-equipped squadron of aircraft with efficient machine guns could do no better than harass the ship. The plating, vertical, protecting exposed parts was thick and, at times, had been penetrated. The horizontal plating had also been mutilated and in places penetrated, but at the expense of the bullets, which had been destroyed. Accordingly, it was agreed that future protection for bridge personnel should be confined to that area only and be at least an inch thick, which would give complete immunity. Later on, she was controlled by wireless and underwent a series of tests in which she was fired upon by 6-inch, 5.5-inch, and 4-inch shells. A total of 1,000 rounds of these various types were fired at her at a range of 14,000 yards, with only a total of 42 hits, where Burt writes, "Most of the shells had hit broadside on and did not get past the upper deck, but were brought to a halt there. 3 rounds did penetrate the thin side plating below the upper deck, but the shells were broken up and did not penetrate the middle deck level. There seemed to be little damage in general." Where, interestingly enough, Renown and Repulse took shots at the gunnery target ship, which struck her as she was moving away. One struck over a beam, ripped up the wood, and scored the upper plating. Some fragments of the beam and plating did penetrate a thin bulkhead below this area. The other shell penetrated the upper deck, over the washroom, and the middle deck transverse bulkhead below before coming to a halt in the feed water tank. These 2 shells were not from their main battery weapons. If they had been, considerable damage would have been done to the ship, and a lot of attention was drawn to those areas of the ship in future tests. Where to close out this bit, we'll look at Burt again. Tests also showed that ships built like Agamemnon or stronger, some of the dreadnoughts, etc., had little to fear from secondary batteries except wrecked upper works and general havoc, but owing to long battle ranges, small calibers were generally ineffective. Agamemnon was used as a target ship until 1926 and then replaced by Centurion. Keep Centurion in mind as we'll cover her next. The next ship we'll be looking at is HMS Centurion, and just in her gunnery target ship role and a little after because it's interesting. Following the war in 1919, she was a part of a few operations like a prisoner of war exchange with the Bolsheviks, and she was sent to the Mediterranean to be part of the newly organized Mediterranean Fleet after the Grand Fleet had broken up. In 1920, Centurion was temporarily put in the reserve at Malta and completed for further service with the fleet in August of that year. However, with the Washington Naval Treaty restrictions, Centurion was on the chopping block, being pretty old by this point, and by April of 1926, she was chosen to replace HMS Agamemnon as a radio-controlled target ship. In this role, the ship was to only be a target for guns up to 8 inches, where in this refit, she was stripped of all small fittings and rig, and the top weight reduced. Turrets were not initially removed, but later they were determined to be unnecessary after the relevant data about their strength had been determined, and so they were removed. Her machinery remained intact, but she was modified to use diesel oil instead of coal. Since her coal bunkers were useless, and to make sure she carried an appropriate amount of weight, they were fitted with rocks. However, her draft was somewhat increased, thus allowing her to not be penetrated below the water. In this role, Centurion was fit with many radio antennas, and with the turrets removed, she looked rather unique in this role. She was capable of about 16 knots in this role, and through further refits and work that saw the turrets removed, her bridge and superstructure were reduced. Her complement to maintain her was about 240 men, and of course, when being a target ship, they were not on board. As a radio-controlled target ship, Centurion was used to test the gunnery of cruisers and even dive bombers. However, in 1931, she was laid up in reserve as an economizing measure with the Great Depression in full swing. In 1933, she was further refitted to serve in this role as a radio-controlled target ship. In this role, the ship took a tremendous beating, especially by the Atlantic Fleet, and in July 1934, the 1st Cruiser Squadron put their mark on the ship with their 8-inch guns. Throughout the 1930s, she was in and out of repair due to the nature of her duty, wherein she was serving in this role until the start of the Second World War. Centurion, although one of the oldest battleships left in the Royal Navy, albeit without her guns, they still saw value in her. So much so in 1940, there were plans to refit her as some sort of anti-aircraft platform for the Norwegian campaign. And given the losses in that campaign for both sides, it was probably better for Centurion that it didn't happen. Instead, she was transformed into a repair and maintenance ship for the local defense forces and a block ship. Now, Churchill, known for his schemes, came up with one where he wanted the Mediterranean fleet to bombard the harbor of Tripoli on the Libyan coast, which, of course, would be risky for the Mediterranean fleet to do. Admiral Andrew Cunningham was wary of this, and he became even more wary when Churchill wanted a battleship sunk in the entrance to the harbor as a block ship. Not wanting to give up any of his battleships, it was suggested that Centurion serve in this role. Thankfully again for Centurion, this did not happen as the idea was scrapped, and instead, Centurion was chosen for another role. Sometime between 1939 and 1941, the dates are a bit hard to pinpoint down as there are conflicting dates with usually reliable sources, Centurion was chosen to be a dummy battleship. This meant that she was given a makeover with fake turrets, superstructure, and other fittings to make her look like a King George V class from the 1936 estimates, HMS Anson. This deception is pretty convincing, and is what Centurion is arguably best known for. The British took an elderly battleship and disguised her as a more modern and more powerful battleship, something that had been cooked up by Churchill in the First World War with merchant ships, and even done to Iron Duke in the Second World War. Although you can pick out the flaws in Centurion's disguise, from the air which it was intended for, it certainly would be hard to tell. In this role, she was fitted with guns again, 2 2-pounders and 8 20mm guns. Later in 1942, she was given 4 2-pounders and 17 20mm guns. She was going to help in Operation Vigorous, where she and 8 light cruisers, 26 destroyers, 4 corvettes, and 2 minesweepers attempted to escort a convoy under the command of Admiral Philip Vian from Alexandria to Malta. In this, Centurion was attacked by German bombers, helping to shoot down some of them. Vigorous would not reach Malta due to the air attacks and the threat of the Regia Marina. She was to keep her disguise for quite a bit of time, apparently sailing 20,000 miles with it on, at least according to R.A. Burt. However, Centurion never really had an opportunity to put her excellent costume to work in home waters. Centurion served in one last and very important role. Between May and June 1944, she was stripped of all of her equipment at Portsmouth for use as a block ship as part of the breakwater for the Mulberry prefabricated harbor at Omaha Beach. Centurion did not serve in this role for very long, as the storm of June the 19th, 1944, wrecked her. She broke in two and was scrapped in place following the war. This is going to be a multiple-part series, as there are quite a few gunnery target ships I'd like to cover, particularly from the United States Navy. An interesting book on this subject is Unmanned Systems of World War I and II by H.R. Everett. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a book anywhere for a reasonable price, as I'm certainly not paying $1,200 for it. But if you can find it for less, I'm sure it'd be interesting to look at. Anyway, please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, my friends, have a great week.